Before the Reformation, every Scottish community had a witch, just like they had a blacksmith and a miller. Then came 1563 and everything changed. Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're welcoming back historian and author Mary W. Craig, who joins us to discuss her new book, A History of Scottish Witches, The Devil's Handmaidens.
Did you know Scotland prosecuted witches at 10 times the rate of England?
Mary's book examines 150 years of trials, from the signing of the 1563 Witchcraft Act by Mary, Queen of Scots, through its abolition. Welcome back to the podcast. Please tell us about yourself and work.
Okay, me? Hi, I'm Mary. I'm a Scottish writer and historian. I write about ordinary people and how their lives are affected by the politics, the economics, and the religion of the elites. And I have a particular interest in the women and men who were persecuted as witches in the 16th and 17th century.
And you have a new book coming out in the new year. Can you tell us briefly about it, and why did you choose to write this particular book?
A couple of reasons. The book is called A History of Scottish Witches, and it's a sort of overarching book because the topic, there are so many elements to this topic, and this book takes you from the writing of the Witchcraft Act all the way through to its abolition. And there's a lot more of the politics of the day and what it meant and the social structures of the day, because I think sometimes, because it is such an emotive issue, we get a little bit caught up in the emotion of it, and we forget to take a step back to see why did it arise in that society at that time. And so that's what this book is a little bit more about, especially things like the drafting of the Act, which a lot of people are surprised by the fact that the Act was signed off by Mary, Queen of Scots. And people often think of it as very gendered violence, but she was actually the reigning monarch who signed the Act into being, and then looking at the social structures of men and women at that time and how that allowed the persecution of women and men to develop. So that's, rather than a geographically specific book, which I've written before, or one focusing on one individual, it's much more of a societal book. Although, again, it's still based predominantly in lowland Scotland, because up in the Gaeltacht, there was a whole other thing going on. And I'm still trying to write about that. But the Highlands and Islands are proving elusive. But that's a book and a podcast for another day.
Yeah, that sounds great too. You put that timeline in your book, and I spent so much time just looking at that timeline because it just really helps you visualize all these things across this time happening. And I particularly enjoyed when the witches tried to drown the king in the timeline, the way that's labeled. That was so great. Mm-hmm. But I mean, that's just a tool in the book full of incredible, complex information. It is a book that causes you to reflect. And when I'm looking at these elements, I do get emotional. But this book allows you to stop and let's look at the facts here. But it really, as a woman and a descendant, I do find myself particularly enraged at moments when you're reading these things that came together. What kind of specific factors collided during Scotland's witch hunting era to create such a distinctly deadly environment?
Well, we had a huge amount of political upheaval. We had 1603 when Queen Elizabeth of England dies and James VI of Scotland becomes James I. And he leaves the country. So that sort of leaves a power vacuum. You've got the fact that the Reformation isn't settled. The Counter-Reformation is coming to the fore. So they're religiously unsettled. People are politically unsettled. In the middle of the century, there is the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, and we chop the king's head off. There's war going on in the continent where you've got the 30 Years' War. Climatically, it was quite a bad century as well. The climate was in quite a bit of flux. You've still got the tail end of the Little Ice Age in there. So there's a lot of famine, there's a lot of harvest failure. So the sort of external elements that the church would say, see, that's the devil out trying to destroy us. And if you layer that on top of a very gendered society about the way men should act and the way women should act, and anyone who acts out with the social norms are perceived. In previous centuries, they would have been perceived as other or odd or to be shunned. Now they are to be feared because they could be an agent of the devil. And so all of these sort of factors come together in that 150-year period.
What kinds of records and sources do we have to tell us what happened in the Scottish witch trials?
There are a lot of trial records left in the National Records of Scotland, also in the National Library of Scotland, trial interrogations and trial dates, and the so-called confessions of witches. Now, obviously, we have to be really careful with that because these are predominantly women and men who have been, at the very least, ripped away from their families. They're scared, they're alone, they're being told by everybody that they're probably going to die, they're going to hell and damnation, which is a big thing then. It's not today, as I've always said, I have friends in the Kirk of Scotland, and to them, hell is a theological concept. To them, hell would be the withdrawal of God's love, God's grace. Whereas in the 17th century, it was an actual place you could get sent to. So they're absolutely terrified, and they're being asked questions constantly. They're being kept awake. They may or may not be being tortured, and so they're then being asked a whole lot of questions. We're not exactly sure what the witch might reply. We're not sure how that reply might be interpreted, and then we're not sure how that interpretation might be written down. And you have interrogators who are trying to find out the truth about the devil. They want to know as much as they can so that they can find him, which makes sense. But the way they put the questions would be the sort of thing that would be like a leading question today. You know, when if the police arrest you for a crime, they would say, did you break into that house or did you steal that car? They wouldn't say, when you broke into the house, what did you steal? Because that would be a leading question. But because they're trying to fight the devil and the devil is tricksy, they have to ask what are leading questions. So you're not being asked, did you see the devil? In which case you would say, no. You're being asked, when you saw the devil, was your sister also with you? Was your mother always with you? So all of these things are put together. And you also have the fact that most interrogators are educated. So they're speaking Scots and English. You might be speaking Scots and Gaelic. Or your level of Scots might not be what their level of Scots is. I will use words to you this afternoon about it's Dreich, and you said, what does that mean? Well, if the interrogator doesn't know what I know what I mean when I say, I met the man in the green hat, didn't show. How does the interrogator know what I mean by that if their dialect isn't my dialect? So all of these elements mean that although we do have these amazing trial records, interpreting exactly what's meant by them is difficult. And I apologise, that was a very long-winded answer.
That's what we love, any length. Thank you for helping us see when you have a record, it's some information, but it's not the full story. You have to really consider, who was talking and who was documenting. Mm-hmm. Tell me about the books that were shaping the witch trials, these authoritative writings.
There are several books. One of the most influential is a book called Demonology, which was written by James VI after the witches allegedly tried to drown him. Now, the thing with James is that he was King of Scotland, and everybody knew Elizabeth I hadn't had any children. So he's got a claim to the throne through his great-grandfather. But the English nobility aren't quite sure that they want a Scottish king, or a Scotch king, as they would have called it. So James has to prove himself worthy of getting the English throne. He can't do it by money, because Scotland's quite a poor country. He can't do it through battle, because for once, Scotland and England are not at war with each other. But the one thing he can do it by is by learning and saying, I'm a very learned king. Look, I've written this book. And James did, to give me credit, he did write several books. And his book, Demonology, of course, well, it's written by the king, so it must be true. And even people who hadn't read it or couldn't read it would say, yeah, but the king's written this big book about witches, so they must exist. Otherwise, why would the king have written about them? So you have books like that. You have books like the Malleus Maleficarum, which I think is one of the world's oddest books, written by a disgruntled cleric who had fallen out with the Bishop of Speyer over a trial where some women had been acquitted of witchcraft. And he writes this book, Malleus Maleficarum, roughly translates into the Hammer of the Witches. And he'd written this book, and it's full of very odd things. There is a lot of sexual imagery in it, which I think is just odd. And the book was so bizarre that the Catholic Church even disowned the book. They said, this has nothing to do with us. But unfortunately, that book arrived round about the same time as the invention of the printing press. So this book, odd though it is everywhere in Europe. So even if you don't read yourself, you know that these books are out there. I always liken it to Stephen Hawking. Professor Stephen Hawking once wrote a book about the universe. It was basically the big boys' book of physics, right? And that book was published, and I'm sure we all bought it and sat it on our coffee table to show to our friends that we had that book. None of us read the book because we couldn't have understood it, because it was A Brief History of Time, I think was the title. But because he was Stephen Hawking, we knew that was the book to have because he was the expert. And so these books that are coming through, you don't even need to read them. You just need to know that they exist. And if the king's saying that, well, there are witches, and that Catholic guy across there says there's witches, and then there's another Jesuit called Del Rio, and he says there's witches, and you said, well, they must exist. There's all these books about them. There's all these learned people writing all these books. And so you think, well, they must know what they're talking about. So even if you're an ordinary little person in the Scottish Lowlands and you're going to the kirk on Sunday and the minister tells you that the devil's out to get you and he's going to use witches, and the great and the good are producing books about witches, well, there's witches. And so what a witch is and what they do and how they act and the malice they can do, the evil they can do, become common currency. So that even people who've never met a witch, they know that witches have cats, they know they have familiars, they know they will cast spells, they know that they will try to ruin crops, because that's what's in the ether, if you like, so that everybody knows about it. Everybody seems to know about it.
Who were the accused witches? What do we know about who these were as people?
For a lot of them, we actually have very little information. But from what we do know, the vast majority of witches were ordinary people. About 84% were women, and the rest were men. And they spanned the very, very poor up to the very, very rich, although there weren't so many of them. Most of them were poor, or what we would call the middling sort. So they had a bit of money, but not a lot else. Most were women. Some were as young as 8 or 10. Some were as old as 80. So it spanned all of society. And even when you delve into the records, a lot of the very basic accusations are incredibly ordinary as well. My hens have stopped laying. My cow isn't giving milk. I fell in front of that woman when she gave me an odd look. They're not great fantastical tales of flying on broomsticks and anything like that. It's very ordinary stuff. But it's ordinary stuff. It's mundane. But it can become murderous because if your hens stop laying, you've nothing to sell in market. You've got nothing to feed your family. So these things matter. Although they seem very ordinary, you think, well, surely if they're magical, they're going to be getting themselves great wealth and gold. That wasn't what mattered. So these were ordinary people with ordinary wares, ordinary worries, ordinary cares of the day, muddling through. And then when something goes wrong, it's the witch gets the blame.
It's so tragic when you consider just these ordinary misfortunes turn into, as you said, this murderous situation and this hunt for the devil. It's unreal that the environment could go from my cows not giving me the milk to this death. And it started with just an accusation.
It often would start with just a squabble like that. And it would often start with something, actually, it might not even be a proper accusation. It might be that you've got two neighbours arguing, two neighbours who share a field, or maybe my cow has wandered into your field and trampled over your crops. and I shout at you, and you shout back at me, and I shout at you, and then one of us says, "Oh, go away, you old witch." And it's a word, and it's said, and it's out there, but then later on, if something happens, that's remembered. And you think, oh yeah, and she wasn't at the kirk on Sunday. It's almost as it builds a little momentum. And then, of course, you do have women tended to have the caring roles. So if an elderly relative has died or a child has died, well, who's taking care of them? Oh yes, the charmer, the healer down the road. So some of the people that are arrested are listed as charmers or healers or midwives using folk medicine. But of course, because the caring role with the female role all becomes twisted. So it's very, very difficult. If my baby dies of a fever and yet my next door neighbour's baby lives, well, why would that be? Who was taking care of my baby? People are desperate. The world has been turned upside down. The king's gone. You've been told to change your religion. There's a war going on. The harvest has failed. And you go to your minister and all you're getting is, it's the devil, it's witches, it's the devil, it's witches. Well, you're going to say, it must be a witch then, because there is no other explanation.
In the book, you identify the Reformation and the Scottish Witchcraft Act of 1563 as the turning points where previously long-held beliefs suddenly became a capital crime. Could you explain how John Knox's specific theological views, particularly about women and the devil, shaped the new law and laid a foundation for witch hunts?
Yes, and he's another one who wrote books. John Knox is a very interesting person. He was he was a Protestant. He has had an amazing life. He goes across and he learns Protestantism from John Calvin, and he takes teachings of Calvin and turns it into quite a hard form of Calvinism. He argues with people like Bloody Mary of England. He believes that power is unnatural to women. He's very much, his theology, his religion is very biblically based. And woman has been created as a helper to man. Therefore, women are inferior to men. And therefore, power is unnatural to women. So women who have power can only have it from an unnatural source. So initially he was talking about female leaders, and he writes his book, The First Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. And again, this is a book that very few people other than the educated classes read. The idea is the fact that powerful women shouldn't be ruling countries is then taken, and then that's put into the mix of, right, how come the wifey at the end of the road seems to have the power to survive illness? How come her chickens never become ill and stop laying? How come her granddaughter didn't die of the fever? How come her crops grow? She must have this special power. And so previous to the Reformation, there were witches. There have always been witches. They were healers, they were charmers, and the Catholic Church sort of disapproved of them. But the secular authorities just left it alone. Unless you went and you said, wee genie next door to me laid a spell on my chickens, they might be admonished for that, or they might be taken from the church. They could be excommunicated, they could be exiled from the church or branded or whipped. But it wasn't a capital offence. John Knox is in Scotland. He's trying to push his form of Calvinism. He thinks that power is unnatural to women. And then who comes to rule Scotland? What we would call a wee French lassie. Mary Queen of Scots turns up. And not only is she female, but she's Catholic. She's everything that John Knox finds abhorrent. He finds that a reversal of what it should be. God said that women were here to help men. How can this young Catholic woman be in charge of Scotland? And so this to him proves that the devil is out to try and dismantle the Reformation. Because the Reformation is going to be a hard one. The devil is going to attack because he's going to use it to upend everything. And what has the devil done? The devil has sent a young Catholic woman to try and rule Scotland. And as far as John Knox is concerned, that's it. That's proof positive. And this is going to unleash the devil and all of his helpers and witches right the way across Scotland. we need to put a stop to this. We need to have it in the statute books that we're not going to have this. And he is going to, through political horse trading, force Mary to sign this act that makes witchcraft and witches and necromancers, makes a bold, bold statement. He's been able to force this female Catholic leader with this unnatural power, bend to his will and put that act through. So it's very strong. I dislike John Knox as a character, but I can understand, given his theological position, the way he acted, the way he did. I'm not excusing what he did, but I think his theology and his genuine faith explains what he did.
And that's what kind of a war for him, like a spiritual war.
Yeah.
And that was like directly an assault against the long-held beliefs of the ordinary people. And how did he take away a vital source of their psychological comfort when he took away the fairies?
Well, this is it, because if you believe in Scotland, I mean, Scotland's an old country, and we've got fairies and elves and skelpies and leprechauns and all sorts of exciting beasties and baubles, as we would say, that roam Scotland, and they've roamed Scotland for forever, and I think they're still out there. When the Catholic faith comes in, the Catholic faith almost finds an accommodation. I think the Catholic faith felt that if you turned up to church on Sunday and you gave respect to the priest, the fact that you also went out and left bread and cheese for the fairies on a Wednesday, they weren't really that bothered. It was sort of okay. So it meant if something bad happened to you, you could go to your priest to get comfort, and you could pray to a guardian angel or a saint or the Holy Mother in the same way as you could go and commune with the fairies. So you had a lot of emotional support there if something went wrong. And you could go and you could talk to the fairies, you could have a conversation with them, you could have a conversation with your priest. Protestantism comes in and Calvinism comes in and does away with all of the priesthood. Your religion is that you have to stand in front of God yourself. So there's no mediator, there is no priest, there is no guardian angels, there's no Madonna for you to talk to. You can talk to God, but that is it, and you stand alone. And the fairies either don't exist, or if they do exist, they might be imps of a sort of followers of the devil. So all of that emotional support is taken away in a century when you actually need emotional support because war's going on, famine's going on, pestilence is going on. You need all of that, and it's all been taken away from you. You have to be naked in front of God. You have no support. And the minister, the Calvinist minister, does not support you. It's one of the reasons why there were fewer witch accusations and fewer trials up in the Gaeltacht in the Highlands and Islands because of the number of the clans that retained their Catholicism and retained their belief in fairies. So they didn't have quite as stark a time as their lowland cousins did.
Was there widespread belief among the ordinary people in witches before the Reformation? And what role did the Scottish folk beliefs about witches play in the witch trials?
Oh yes, every community had a witch. And the way every community had a midwife, or every community had a miller, or every community had a blacksmith. You just did. And the witch might be nice, or she might be nasty, the same way the blacksmith might be nice or might be nasty. They were just there. And they had their power from the fairies, and they could help you if you'd lost something, or you needed your child healed, or maybe a bad witch had put a spell on you and you needed another witch to take that spell off. They were a part of the community because they were a part of the magical fairy world that everybody believed in. And most people believed probably until about halfway through the 17th century when it sort of got beaten out of them. Everybody believed in this. People believed in God as well. They believed in God and the devil, but the fairies and magic was there alongside it. And witches were just the sorts of people that could talk to the fairies, or they had power from the fairies, or they might have the second sight. They might be able to foretell things. And as I say, the witch was just as much a part of any community as a blacksmith was. And they might be nice, they might be nasty. The church wasn't exactly fond of them, but they existed. And it was accepted throughout society. I mean, if you think of one of the best advisors that Elizabeth I had was a chap called John Dee. And depending on how you read John Dee could have been a counsellor, and he was, could have been an astrologer, and he was, could have been an alchemist, and he was, could have been a conjurer, and he was, could have been an necromancer, could have been a wizard. There's a whole heap of labels, and he was a counsellor in Elizabeth I's court. So even the upper classes believed in magic and fairies and witches.
But diabolical fear wasn't attached specifically to witches.
No, because pre the Reformation, the devil was there. We knew he was there, but witches were associated with the fairies. The power came from the fairies, not from the devil, not from Satan. That was only imposed once the Calvinism comes in and you have the predestination thing of, some people are already saved and some people are not. And that becomes quite a knot, because if you're a Calvinist minister, although you believe yourself to be saved, you can't know God's mind. Nobody can. So you're thinking, am I really saved? And it becomes a situation where if I am one of the saved, if I am one of God's elect, then the devil will attack me, and he will attack me using witches. Therefore, the more witches I find, the more saved I am, and the more saved I am, the more witches I'll find. So that is a little knot that Scottish Calvinism tied round the people's necks, if you like.
I want to turn to one of the specific events in the timeline. In 1661 to 1662, there was this massive witch panic, and hundreds of people got accused. Could you tell us about the sort of abuses that were happening in the local courts that forced the Privy Council to step in?
Yeah, 1661, 62 panic is very distinctive in that because episcopacy had been reintroduced into Scotland, so the Calvinist Presbyterian structure within the Church of Scotland, which wasn't settled at that point, episcopacy had been brought back in, and you have yet again more disruption. You have again more disruption after we'd chopped the king's head off, and now Charles II is back. So there's all sorts of political upheaval. And because of that, you get a real surge in fear, and you get a real surge in accusations. And the courts seem to run wild. And you end up with people being arrested and tried without warrant. The courts are supposed to write to Privy Council for permission to try a witch, a commission to try, which is to investigate and then have a trial. They're doing this. A lot of the lesser rural courts are not bothering with the paperwork. Torture is being applied where it need not be applied. There are younger and younger people being arrested who should not have been arrested. There are people whom they would call, addled in their wits, who were mentally incapacitated by old age or mental illness, are being brought to trial when they should not have been brought to trial. And again, almost builds a momentum. And of course, like any system you have, although there are those who genuinely think they're doing God's work, there are those who will abuse that system. So they jump on the bandwagon, and you're getting accusations that have got absolutely nothing to do with witchcraft getting caught up in that, and it builds and builds and builds to a frenzy before it collapses in on itself. And that's when the Privy Council and the lawyers think, oh, what just happened there? There are just under about 4,000 trials or trial records that we have, but there's probably another couple of thousand that have just got lost along the way, obviously over time. I think there's a bigger chunk of 61, 62 trials missing, and I think afterwards people have gone back in and deliberately destroyed those trials, those trial records, because of the excesses. There are notes in some counts books scattered across the country, scattered in different archives and libraries, and it's quite poignant, some of the notes that are in there about the amount of money spent on burning a witch, or the amount of money spent on guarding a witch. I've seen letters from people writing and pleading and saying, my wife is no witch, please, I don't know why you've arrested her, there is no accusation, she hasn't done anything. So it really was a really, really bad period, 61, 62.
And money was being made by prosecuting.
Well, yes, it's interesting because most of the time, taking a witch to trial and executing didn't make a lot of money. But in the 61, 62, there were people whose hands were in pockets. Absolutely. There were magistrates who were getting their expenses. There were people who were making a little bit of money here, there, and everywhere. Yes, and also, I know I've got a friend who's currently looking at this, and she's currently looking at the land registers. And she thinks, so she's very early research at the moment, but she thinks that there's quite a pattern there of young men who have decided that maybe their mother-in-law is a bit of a witch, and she gets accused. And the thing is that mother-in-law's got a really nice field, and all of a sudden, if she's got a witch accusation, then the field gets given to the son-in-law. So there's a few cases. Now, you always get that abuse of any situation, but she's uncovering these. So maybe there might be a little bit of a pattern there in the 61, 62 trials. And of course, it's the land register she's looking at. So you think, well, that's not going to have anything to do with it. But you just think, it's just interesting that there might be a few little parcels of land going here, there, and everywhere. So it'll be interesting to see what her research is finally uncovered.
If that is the case, that is a pattern that you see in other contexts where in-laws are taking out mother-in-laws, sister-in-laws, and there's usually something of value for them.
Especially mothers-in-law, because of course, in the gendered society of the day, once you're past childbearing age, you're an extra mouth to feed. You're a bit of a burden on the family, really, aren't you? So, now, okay, you can take care of the grandchildren a little bit, and you can do a bit of healing if somebody's ill, but you're not really contributing to the house, are you? And maybe you're sort of surplus to requirements. Maybe we can just get rid of granny in the corner type thing. And because, of course, you then also, the older you get, the more you become the caricature of the witch. Because this is a period when, if you look at the portraiture of that era, people are, especially they're in nice clothing and you've got your nice portraits going on and you're a bit older and maybe your hair's gone a bit grey and maybe your clothes aren't quite what they're. So you become the caricature of the witch, the old lady with the hunchback, the old lady with, you're feeding the cat, maybe you're chatting to your pet cat or something. Was that her familiar? So the older you get as a woman, the more you are at risk of being seen as a burden on the family anyway. And if you then, maybe you're a bit of a witch as well. So all of that comes together.
We still see that playing out in countries around the world today with witchcraft accusations and persecution. That you go after the older women, especially if they have some land that you could get a hold of or anything you could gain.
And we still have this situation where women are judged on their appearance more than men are.
Oh,
that's not a new phenomenon, unfortunately.
And it's still called witches. Even in our culture, women are still called witches for just any old reason.
And you're right. It's still that pejorative term, whereas you're a wizard, Harry, or he's a wizard at doing maths, or he's a wizard at doing this. Oh, she's a right witch. Still a pejorative term in a lot of cases. Even if it's not got the full historical meaning, it'll be said in conversation, or politicians will always do it. Any politician of any political party who's ever investigated for anything always claim it's a witch hunt. Always.
Always. And the legal system during that panic and some of these other trials, the women were completely vulnerable because it was a man-run court. There was no power for them.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, you get arrested by the bailey, who's a man. The bailey or the sheriff arrests you. The minister who's probably leading the accusation and the interrogation is a man. The people who ward you are men. Very occasionally, women will be brought in to examine you to see if they can find the devil's mark on you, but predominantly that's done by men. All of the scribes in the court, they're all men. Obviously, the executioner is a man. So, there is no one there. And that's a problem, because in that society, the only man who has the right to literally physically touch you is your father, your husband, your adult son, and possibly a brother. So for other men to come to your house and physically lay hands on you and take you to prison, that's a huge thing. And it's a huge point of horror for the woman and shame for a husband, because husbands are supposed to protect their wives from other men touching them. So it's a huge issue if you are brought in front of the court or brought in front of an examiner where they're trying to find the devil's mark on you, and they're looking at your neck and your head and they're loosening your clothing. I mean, that's just an unbelievable thing to have happened to you. And again, that is the equivalent of a sexual assault. It is the equivalent of a sexual assault today. And for husbands and sons and fathers, it's unthinkable that they have been unable to protect their wife, their daughter, their mother from such a scandalous thing to have happened to them. So these gendered roles really matter.
Yeah. How did witnessing all this create deep confusion and fear for the children of the women as well as the rest of their families?
Yeah. I think the generational trauma is something that needs even more research. If you think about it, if you're a 5, 6, 7-year-old child and you're happily living in your community, and then all of a sudden the leader of the community, the minister, you go to church every Sunday with your mum and dad, and the minister turns up with 2 big, strong men and they physically drag your mother away in front of your eyes. Men are touching your mother. They physically drag her out the house. All of your neighbours are now looking at you strangely. It's being whispered that your mum's a witch. The minister that Sunday might give a great big long sermon in the kirk about evil women. You don't know where your mummy is. Your mummy's been taken away. And the next time you see your mummy, she's possibly shaven head. She's in a hair shift. Her hair's all over the place. She is publicly executed in front of your eyes. And then her dead body is burned. And that can take days. And that's in a public space. And you see that as a child. The level of trauma, I can't even begin to imagine the level of trauma that a 5-year-old would go through. If you then take that 5-year-old child up to the age of 15, and they then have no emotional, psychological release for that trauma, they would act out, would be our sort of modern phrase for it. They're then acting in a way that is not the norm for young women. And so the society looks at her and says, her mother was a witch, and now look at the way she's behaving. She's a witch as well. And that's even for children that don't have any form of neurodivergency. They don't have something like autism or any of these sorts of conditions. And the point is that this isn't a one-off. If this was a one-off, it would be horrific enough. But it's not. You might see your mother dragged away when you're 5 years old. When you're 15, you might see your neighbour dragged away. When you're 30, you might see somebody else dragged away. So this is a constant thing that you know as a woman can happen to you at any time. There's a very tight prescribed behavioural pattern that you're allowed to follow, and you cannot step out of that, even though you have been traumatised by seeing this as a young child. As we've spoken before, there is no priest you can go to, and you can't go and speak to the fairies. Well, you could, but if you're found speaking to the fairies, then, told you, she's the daughter of a witch. So this generational trauma is there all the time. And for the young boy, this is what men do to women. So women are wicked. My mum's a witch, so potentially all women could be a witch. But I'm going to grow up and get married. What if my wife turns out to be a witch? How can I ever trust? The level of distrust, the level of just, your world sort of falls apart because the one person in your community that you would think, I'll go to that one person and they'll fix it, is the person that's leading it, because it's the minister that is leading all of this. And it's one of the reasons why I noticed earlier you'd said that you being a descendant, there are very, very few people in Scotland who can claim to be the descendant of a witch, because people were so scared that they changed names. They denied maternity, that wasn't really my mother, I was a foundling, no, actually I'm not really from the family. So there's this trauma, and there's a definite people saying no. And we find it time and again. If someone is even mentioned in a witch trial, they disappear off into the record. We can't find them, so we can't trace the way you folks can trace, because that generational trauma is there for so long.
The descendants in the United States, I think that it was kind of a family secret. We know people moved. We do know surnames were adjusted. There's usually a similar form. But Rebecca Nurse, who happens to be my ancestor who was hanged, her early descendants put a monument up for her in the 1880s. And that was one of the first monuments for an accused witch somewhere. And I feel like that moment really started to change for her descendants and then others. And I think as we go back and uncover the other stories before Salem that occurred in Boston and Hartford, other descendants are finding the lineage and starting to look at that. But I do think there was hidden history there, but not to the extent. And part of that would have to do with there's a lot fewer families who lost mothers and fathers to witchcraft accusations. Scotland's, the population that suffered this way is enormous.
Unfortunately, then I think we did something like 10 times as many witch accusations per head of population as there were in England. I mean, it's a ridiculous number. Scotland's population at that time was possibly about 900,000. To have 6,000 people accused, and those are just the ones we know about. I mean, unfortunately, we have trial records, or we have often accounts records from areas that will say things like, some witches were hanged today. And we don't know what that means. We don't know, does that mean 2? Does that mean 20? And we often don't even have names. And again, it'll be, we killed some witches, or many witches were hanged today. And that's all we've got. We don't have a trial record. So we don't know how many, and we don't have names for those individuals. And that's what's really, really quite poignant, is the fact that we don't even have these people's names.
Yeah. The risk was so high because so many were finding themselves in the crosshairs.
Yeah. The Kirk of Scotland didn't exactly help itself, because we had the abolition of the Act take place in 1736. But then in 1777, the Kirk of Scotland reaffirmed its belief that witches and witchcraft were real. And they were absolutely furious when the Act was repealed. They were absolutely, unbelievably angry that it should be done. And they did push to actually have the repeal repealed, if you know what I mean, because they were so angry at that. So it wasn't as if after all the excesses and after everybody had calmed down a bit and the lawyers had realised you can't actually prove these alleged acts, the Kirk was absolutely adamant, as far as it was concerned, that act should have stayed on the statute books.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Time has absolutely flown by today. It's been so great listening to you and learning about this. Do you have any final comments, anything you wanted to say today that you haven't had a chance to speak to?
I would just say to anybody, listen to your podcast, because it's great, and learn from it. Learn from the fact that it's not just a horrific part of history. The fact is that, unfortunately, it's still going on today. I'm not expecting everybody to go out and be an activist, but to just be aware of how easily we can slip into these terrible acts, and the fact that, unfortunately, it's still happening today. So I know it's a dark subject for a lot of people, and it is, but we can only confront the dark stuff that we do if we know about it. So try and learn a little bit more, and try and always be aware that, unfortunately, ordinary people were accused, but also ordinary people made the accusations. We're not all perfect, and we should remember that.
And when is the book available, and how can people get a hold of it?
The book should be available from the end of February, but it's already available for pre-order via the publishers, Pen and Sword. I think it's actually also available for pre-order on Amazon and also in Barnes and Noble. But probably if you go to the publisher, that's probably your best place to start with. Pen and Sword.
It's a great book. I've just really enjoyed being in it, and thank you for doing the work to build the story out so we can better understand the history and the experiences of the Scottish women. Thank you, Mary W. Craig, for joining us again today. Her book, A History of Scottish Witches, The Devil's Handmaidens, is available for pre-order now and releases in February 2025. You can support our podcast by buying it in our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/endwitchhunts.
We've read it and highly recommend it. It's an essential book for all of us learning about witch hunts. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.